Hello, my name is Dr. Kyle Livy, and this is History 106A, which is a world history course starting with the dawn of man, bringing us all the way up to about 1500 of the Common Era. And I'm here today to give you a little introduction to the course so you can get to know what we're going to do in the class and get a sense of the things we'll cover, but also a little bit more about the structure of the class. I'm hoping you've had a chance to already kind of explore and look around the course a bit. I've set things up so you can see things at least a few weeks into the future, so you can see into the future. It's a history class, but we look into the future too, so you can see how the class is going to go and what we're going to do together. And I'm really excited to be able to share this class with you and to go over this material. We cover a lot of ground in a very, very short semester. Why don't we go ahead and get started? And I want to talk a little bit about history and how history works. For some of you, this may be the first history class you've taken since high school, or one of the first few history classes you've taken at the college level. And I want to talk about this idea of history because historians, like myself, think about the past in a lot of different ways. And one way I like thinking about it that I think has a lot of resonance and really connects with a lot of us is memory. We remember our pasts very clearly. Sometimes things don't come as clearly, and there are other things that stand out to us that have shaped us and form who we are. But I want us to think about how human memory works because it's incredibly selective and it's incredibly different than I think a lot of us think. A lot of us think our memories are like hard drives. Like if you're listening to this now and you're thinking, maybe trying to remember what it was like on your first day of school ever. And some of you probably have memories of that. Some of you may not. We don't all remember the same things. We don't record things and then access them like a hard drive or like a videotape, right? Instead, right, we remember things not as products of the past, but cognitively as products of the present. Brain science has taught us that the way we remember things is informed entirely by our present. So if we take that example of our first day of school, the way you may have described your first day of school maybe 10 years ago, right, when you were much younger, okay, is different than you describe it today. We gain experience, we gain vocabulary, we gain a perspective on the world that differs as we grow older. And so our memories change. And this is really important. Memory is a product of the present. History is also a product of the present in which it's written. We don't have a perfect account of how everything happened, but historians are always finding new source material, or always exploring things in different ways and looking at things from a different perspective. So our view of the past is always becoming more complicated, it's growing and becoming different. And it's one of the reasons why it's so exciting to be a historian, because history is not fixed, but instead is a product of what we see going forward. Now, history is also about making stories and building stories. And here I refer to it in this outline that you see here as constructing narratives, right? That's just a fancy way of writing and telling stories. And that's what historians do. They tell the story of the past. Narrative is really important to us, right? We analyze a lot about what's happening in the past, but that's what helps to shape how we tell a story. Now, I want to share with you where these stories come from, because in some cases, the way we might tell our past, it might kind of come out of thin air, right? We might just sort of make it up, and that's not great. Historians do not try to do that. They shouldn't do it at all, right? Instead, they use source material, okay? And there are three kinds of sources, and in this class you're going to see all three. There are three kinds of sources that historians use. Okay, two more importantly to us and to what we do. The first kind of source are primary sources, and these are what we call first-hand accounts. Someone's diary, an image created from that time or era. It can be data or material that was accumulated and collected during that time. A newspaper is a contemporary example of a primary source, right? Because if you have a newspaper article, say, from long ago, it tells us how that story was being told in that day and time. So it's a first-hand account of what's going on. Now, this idea of primary sources, it's complicated. Not all human societies produced writing, right? Some societies did not develop that particular kind of technology, and so as a result, right, the way those firsthand accounts are passed down is more through, say, oral tradition. So different kinds of primary sources have to be looked at differently, and we'll spend some time talking about that over the course of this class and this term. Now, secondary sources are a little different. Secondary sources are a sort of assemblage, a putting together of primary sources in order to put, really to understand a history. That's really the process of us telling the story. A secondary source is a piece of scholarly work that is trying to synthesize or pull together primary sources. Now, this is what you might look at. Historians look at this a lot. It's what historians do, is write secondary sources based on the primary sources that they find and use. And so secondary sources are pieces of scholarship. An analogy I like to use, because I like to cook and I like to bake, right? One analogy I like to use is primary sources are like really good ingredients. Like if you were to go to a really nice, market and buy really fresh ingredients, and secondary sources are what you cook with it, like what you produce. Like if I wanted to, say, bake a cake, right? The primary sources are the ingredients like sugar and flour, etc. Okay, and then the cake itself is the secondary source. So what then are tertiary sources? It's interesting because I think a lot of students have a general idea of primary and secondary sources, but they've never heard of tertiary sources, which is kind of interesting because it's this kind of source I think you're most familiar with. Tertiary sources are textbooks. They're summaries of secondary sources. When you're reading the textbook we use for this course, you might notice this. It seems like so much history. It's all kind of jammed in there. Historians generally don't write a lot of textbooks. They are summaries of what historians do. So in any given paragraph in your textbook, there might be a dozen different studies that have been summarized and boiled down to give you the big picture. Okay? Textbooks are really helpful to students of history to get an overview, but they can be really hard to read because it's sometimes hard to figure out what's important. And part of the work we do in this class is some efforts at kind of unpacking that. A lot of the writing you'll do will unpack what's going on in the textbook, and that will help a lot to figure out what's important. Okay? I used to joke that tertiary sources are like the Twinkies of history, right? They're the lowest common denominator. They're basic. Most historians don't like them. We tend not to use them that often, but they are important. Okay. Another example of a tertiary source might be something like Wikipedia, which is a synthesis of different pieces of scholarship and work into an easy to digest, thing. And I imagine many of you use things like Wikipedia before. Okay. So that's where history comes from. Now, even though it's really clear where sources are coming from, it's also very easy to make up the past. And I told you earlier, historians don't do that. But a lot of people who have an interest in changing the way we see the past, perhaps like a politician or a religious leader or someone with a kind of power that might be threatened, right? They will manufacture history. They will make up a past, or they'll look at history from a particular angle. Now, historians are always endeavoring to be as objective as possible, right? There's really nothing that can be achieved as like pure objectivity. It's not possible for humans to be 100% objective, but we work to be as objective as possible by relying on evidence that sources drive the historian. But people who are not historians don't necessarily have to be driven by sources. And to illustrate this and how history can be made up and changed very easily today, I want to tell you a little story. And this is actually something that happened fairly recently, and I tell my students this story often. And to be clear, I'm not trying to make fun of the center of the story, this politician who ends up being in the center, because it's actually not her fault, okay? There's a politician who used to be the governor of Alaska named Sarah Palin. You might know her best because she went on to be nominated to be vice president about halfway through her first term as governor in Alaska, nominated to be the Republican nominee for vice president in 2008 with John McCain. He was the Republican nominee for president running against Barack Obama. Now, unfortunately for them, they lost, right? And so afterwards, Palin left office and she took a vacation with her family to a whole bunch of different important sites in early American history, okay? Now, while she was on this vacation, the press obviously were following her and asking her questions. And one day while she was in a bakery, Okay, the press asked her what she had learned about Paul Revere, and this turned into a huge media story. Now, to be fair, again, in just to say this, this is not really about Sarah Palin. You'll see that in a minute or two, but I want to show you this video. And I also should say, as a professional historian, if someone approached me in a bakery asking me questions about history, I'd be like, wait until I eat my pastry. But here's what happened. Here's the story. I want to show you this little news clip. Okay.
It appears Sarah Palin may need to brush up on her American history. She visited the Old North Church today here in Boston, the focal point of Paul Revere's historic ride, but it sounds like she got a bit confused on the details.
He who warned the British that they weren't going to be taking away our arms by ringing those bells and making sure as he's riding his horse through town to send those warning shots and bells that we were going to be secure and we were going to be free.
Okay, so you saw in that, and I'm sorry, I actually made myself the center of the video for a second, but you saw that what she was saying. Now, this was made, a lot of people made fun of this because in essence of the video, she's saying that Paul Revere rode his horse, shot his gun, rang the bell, very hard to do on horseback. If we were together, I would show you, try to simulate, right, to warn the British that the British were coming. Now, people made fun of her. And that's, a lot of times, I would say politicians, regardless of their political background, know a ridiculously small amount about our history, which is really too bad. But that's another story. But that's what this was about, okay? So after this story hit and people were making fun of her, there were a lot of people who were really upset, people who were her followers. So they went on a page I just mentioned a little while ago called Wikipedia, and this is actually a screen capture that you see above of the Wikipedia page for Paul Revere. They actually went in and changed the entry for Paul Revere to match what she had said. And this became a national news story. There's a New York Times article here that you can read if you're interested. This outline, by the way, is linked in that course agenda and introduction. And anytime I talk with you, the outlines are always listed there. Okay, so you can go ahead and check this out. But people were really kind of perplexed by this. It's a pretty fascinating thing. Anyone can change Wikipedia and, in essence, change a major point where people learn history. And that's why what historians do is so important and is so vital, which is to create a document of the past, right, which is informed and driven by sources, not driven by political whims, not driven by individual desire, not driven by feeling or emotion, but driven by the sources. We tell the story of the past based on the best sources that we can find, okay? So historians tell stories, and we've talked a little bit about this, but they also analyze the sources. They don't just accept sources at face value. In this course, you're going to get a chance to explore. It's kind of an amazing experience to dig into thousands of years of human history and look at some of them, really kind of some of the most interesting and perplexing sources. But part of it is not just taking what it says at face value, but analyze what's going on behind it and try to understand the perspective and maybe even the bias of the source to better tell that story. And this is what historians do. They don't just tell a story, but they also analyze historical material, right? And that's the sort of complementary relationship between narrative and analytical history, okay? Now, a lot of what we do in this class is really geared towards understanding how academic history works, right? And certainly, most of you in this class, I imagine, have some interest in history at some level, but a few of you might be wanting to follow a path in becoming a historian and study and focus on history. Others might be just curious about it. And so it's important to understand how academic history is produced, but also to understand there's a real kind of array of different ways to study and think about history. And a lot of historians today, people study the field of history, and a lot of fields that are connected to it go into something we call public history, working in museums, working in schools, being involved in those areas. And again, those two realms of history complement each other as well. And we'll have a chance to kind of explore both of those fields in this course. Now, there are a few important terms that we need to know to start off in this class. We're covering an immense amount of ground, and we do a lot of overview, a lot of sense of the big picture of what's happening. And that's really important here. This is not about memorizing dates, not about focusing on tiny, minute details, but instead looking at case studies to be able to understand the big changes that are taking place all across the globe. To do that, we have to have some tools. We have to have a bit of a toolkit. And that toolkit is really based on the terminology I'm going to go through right now. The first term I want to introduce is something called worldview. Historians who study world history, okay, particularly topics like, say, migration and cultural interaction, these are things that I'm very interested in my research. We talk a lot about this idea of worldview. Each group of people, each society, each nation has specific ways of looking at the world around them. And I want you to think about this. If you were to describe your worldview, that includes your religious beliefs and values, your perspective on how the world works, your perspective on social relationships, the meanings of different signs and symbols. These are all very important. Not all human beings share the same worldview. And if there's a recurrent story, things that we just keep coming back to over and over in this course is when groups of people who are very different from one another come into contact with one another, there can be a lot of problems because they see the world in such different ways. And by sharing those worldviews, even if it's shared in a not so pleasant way, perhaps through violence, there can be, a growth and a change in how one sees the world. And you can think about lots of examples from human history of this. We'll definitely see quite a few of them in this course. The next term, and this is really tied to worldview, is a term that academics use quite a bit in the social sciences, particularly historians and anthropologists, and this is a notion called cultural relativism. It's not our job in this course, okay, or in academic study to assess or judge other cultures, okay, but instead not to use our own culture as a yardstick or as a way to measure cultures, but instead to understand those cultures and those peoples in their own terms, right? And this is really important. We're going to be looking at human societies over the course of thousands of years that really ran differently than we do today. There might be some commonalities, but they believed in different things and they saw the world in different ways that might be very different than, say, our spiritual beliefs or our perspective on, say, science. It's not our job to go in and say they were wrong. Instead, it's to deeply understand why they saw the world in that way. And that's what helps us to have a much more objective, sort of less polluted by bias, but an objective viewpoint on that historical past. Now, the next terminology, the next two terms I want to talk about are nation and state. And we use these terms interchangeably a lot in the world today. And certainly in a lot of disciplines, they're used interchangeably, and we don't think about them as much. But for us, it's going to be really important. For historians, for political scientists, these have very firm definitions. A nation is a group of people who have a sense of commonality, okay, a connection. Now, we think about this when people ask you, perhaps, what is your nationality? They're not necessarily asking you what state are you a citizen of. They're asking you about your identity, okay? And this is really key and really important. The idea of nation is something that precedes, in some cases, or helps to form the idea of a state, a modern state. A state is different. It's a political entity. Now, a state might be formed by a nation, or a state might control a nation. An example that we might be more familiar with in the United States, in American history, right? The United States is a state, that controls a variety of different nations of people, of indigenous people that don't necessarily have their own independent governments for much of the United States' history, right? So nation and state are different, but they inform one another. We'll see in the course of world history, especially as we progress closer and closer towards the modern era, is that there's a real desire on the part of nations to have their own states, to have their own political entities and control. And this is really important. Now, the next two terms are also important, and we tend to also use them in some ways interchangeably, but they're really different. One is society, and society means a social arrangement, a connection of people who are connected by some sort of social agreements, right? In fact, a society is really connected by shared culture, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so a society is an assemblage of people. Now, in the contemporary world, right, a society can exist not just, face to face, but can exist online. It's a collection of people, right, who share values and beliefs, who work under the same systems of governance, perhaps, right? But we use the word society a lot in this course because a lot of the groups of people we study don't have the structures that we might associate with like a modern nation state, right? We instead see them kind of as assemblage of people who are figuring things out. Okay, so we tend to use the word society a lot more. Culture is a little different. Now, culture actually comes from a Latin word which means to cultivate. That root word of culture means to cultivate, to grow, right? And this is important because culture is a set of rules, beliefs, values that changes over time, that's associated with societies. It's actually the things that pull people together, societies together, right? Cultures can exist within societies, and you can have within cultures subcultures that deviate in some way from the mainstream. Now, I'm imagining a lot of you, as you're listening to this, are members of more than one culture, right? And have cultural beliefs and values that cross the line. Culture is kind of a messy thing in that way, but it's also so important to understanding the past of humanity. And we're going to study lots of different cultures and how they form and develop. Cultures that, as it turns out, are very different than us, and that's why cultural relativism is so important for what we do in this course. Now, the last thing is actually seemingly pretty easy, but it's something that's important. We actually cross this boundary in this course, and so it's important to bring it up, is that we study in this course time periods which stretch across a long swath of time. And the reality is different human societies have measured that time in different ways, right? Have different ways of storing dates or thinking about the past. We use a system of dating that allows consistency, and it's very much still rooted in the Western tradition. And so as a result, we use the terms Common Era and before Common Era. Now, what we used to use were BC, before Christ, and AD, which is, of course, after the birth of Christ. And so these were terms that were used commonly, and they've been replaced by BCE, before the Common Era, and Common Era. But it actually marks the same time period. It's actually around the birth of Christ where we have this separation, right, between the before the Common Era and the Common Era. And that's why we say, we look at a particular year in history, and that year, right, is either a fix from before or after. Now we count down towards one for before the Common Era, and we count up towards where we are today for the Common Era. We cross that line, you will see it gets kind of messy because the way we cross that line, and you'll see in about 4 or 5 weeks, we will get close to crossing that line for the first time, and you'll see, oh, this can get a little tricky. Just to be careful and be aware of what those terms mean. So now what I want to do very quickly and briefly is to go over the syllabus. The syllabus is your guide for the course. It's the set of rules that we live by in this course, and it's found right as one of the main pages of the course. And you can go there right now. I'm going to actually show you what the syllabus looks like right here, just briefly, and we're going to walk through it together. So this is the syllabus page in the course, and you can see, right, there it is, okay? And this is important. This is what it would look like if you were in a face-to-face class. It would look very similar to this. You have lots of important information, and we'll start right here at the very beginning. There's my name and my contact information. And the best way to reach me, there are 2 ways you can contact me directly. One is actually through the messaging system in Canvas, which is great. Those messages go directly to my email inbox, and so I usually respond to them by email. And that's actually a really good way because you're in Canvas, and it actually records and keeps the message in Canvas, and that's helpful for me. So I prefer if you send a message through that. You also can use, if you'd like, you can contact me directly by email, which is using this email address that's located here. Now, contacting me directly by email is fine. Contacting me by Canvas is fine. They really go to the same place. I like keeping the messages in Canvas whenever I can because it allows me to track when people are reaching out and when we're talking. Now, below that are my office hours. Now, I do online office hours via Skype, and there's information on how to access Skype, or you can download it in the communications section of the course site. So take some time to figure that out before we get started so you can join us in office hours. Office hours take place on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 2. And during that time, I'll have Skype open. For the most part, if it's not open, I'm probably trying to get it open. There might be an issue, and there's a connectivity issue on campus. There might be a bit of a problem, but just be aware that I'm around. Okay, you can also send me a message in that time, and I'll get back to you pretty quickly. With messages, there's some information in the communication section about turnaround. I always shoot for at least 24 hours, if not faster, except for on the weekends, it might be a little bit of a lag, because I need a little bit of rest, too, right? Now, the great thing about my office hours is, in addition to being online, I'm also actually face-to-face. So if you find yourself on campus, you can come to Building 4, and I'm in room 4102, which is actually right on the base floor of Building 4. Very easy to get to. So let's go over the course. There's a course overview here, and it talks about some of the major themes of the course. You should spend some time reviewing this and the student learning outcomes, which are very important to the class. There's only one book that's required for this course, and it's a book called Ways of the World. Now, Ways of the World is available in the bookstore. It's also available online through our bookstore. You can order it directly there or from another bookseller of your choice. You only need volume 1, but make sure you get it with sources. In this class, we will be reading some of the primary sources, so you'll need it with sources. So use the information. If you're not going to order it from our bookstore, use the information, including the ISBN number, to make sure you get the right one. I used the second volume, volume 2, in History 106B. So if you're interested in taking that course or are planning to take that course, you can buy a combined version of this as well, as long as it's with sources, and it's the 3rd edition. And that might save you a little bit of money if you're planning to take 106B. And there also are selected documents and articles and some films as well, and those are all accessible via Canvas. You'll see that as we get started with the modules. So to kind of go over, just to think about the course and how it's structured, we run on a pretty kind of clear formula, okay? Our weekly pattern is to move about a module a week, okay? And each week you'll have reading that's assigned for you in the textbook, and either primary documents or a film to view, okay? And then that's usually due on Mondays, okay? So you need to finish that by Monday, the end of the day Monday. On Wednesday, you'll submit responses to some big picture questions. And these big picture questions are located on the last page of the chapter, right before usually the documents that are included in the chapter. There's a section called Big Picture Questions, and you'll answer those for each chapter each week, and those are due on Wednesday. And there's more information about those actually a little bit further down. We'll talk about that. Okay, and then you'll have discussion board posts, and those discussion board posts are due on Fridays. Okay, each of these due dates is by midnight. Okay, so you have all the way up until midnight to finish them, and then we move on to the next module. And that's explained right here, okay, in narrative form. This is also explained in more detail as we go through the syllabus, and it talks a little bit about the different areas of grading. I use a points-based system of grading in this course, okay, and it's really important to note that in thinking about like a points-based system, that if you miss a few points, it's a big class and there are lots of points. Don't stress, okay? There are definitely areas to earn more points. If something happens, if you don't do as well an assignment as you like, you definitely have the ability to recover in this kind of course, the way it's structured. So don't panic, okay? There's specific expectations here about how you turn in work and how it works. I don't accept late work unless you make arrangements with me and I agree to it in advance. And there are only certain file formats that you're allowed to submit work with, and those are listed above. So please submit using a Word document or a PDF or RTF file. You can't submit using Pages, but you can use other word processors like Pages to convert it to a PDF or an RTF or even a Word document and just save as. You can do that actually with Google Docs as well. Okay, so there are a few areas of assessment. We have document form posts, discussion forum posts, which are explained here. The big picture questions, which I just talked about. The midterm, and we have some essays for midterm that come up actually pretty quick. It's week 6, and then you'll have final essays. And that's it, okay? So it's really important to note there are lots of points for the class. It's okay to stumble a little bit in different places. You'll still have the possibility of doing very well because there are lots of points. Now, I want you to take some time to read carefully over each of these sections of just dealing with discussion forum posts. It actually has a rubric there and explains how they work, big picture questions, talk a little bit about the reading here, and I've explained a little bit of that already, and talking a little bit about primary documents and films. One thing I want to note is I actually keep a separate grade book outside of Canvas. I do post your grades in Canvas, but in terms of calculating your final grade, Canvas can be off in terms of percentages, and it tends to hurt students, and so I always keep a separate grade book as well. If something's not updated in Canvas, don't worry. I always have it updated in my grade book, but if you are concerned, you can always drop me a message. Now, the last sections I want to make sure I call attention to are perhaps the most important, and the most important, I think, to get through here is academic integrity. Issues of academic integrity are one of the biggest challenges we can have in a course like this, and I hate to say this, I'm going to send you a message about this as well directly, that if you violate academic integrity, there are pretty severe repercussions. Not understanding fully how it works is not really an excuse, because I explain it in very bold, clear detail here in these bullet points. If you have questions about that, it's fine, but it's really important to note, do not use outside materials, do not use work or wording or phrasing that you see somewhere else without citing it, okay? And its citation is explained here. When in doubt, cite it. If it's a quote, put it in quotation marks and have a page citation at the end. If it's not a quote, but if it's a changing of the wording, but it's someone else's idea or comes from somewhere else, still put that citation at the end, okay? It's important to note as well that although we interact a lot with each other in this class, the individual assignments should be done on your own, not collectively, okay? And all of the written assignments for the course are submitted through Turnitin. So if anything is pulled from an outside source or the work of another student, it will pop up. And the repercussions, which are explained here, are pretty severe. And I'm pretty rigorous about this, just so you know. I hate that we have to talk about this, but it's very important. We start with some smaller assignments, so it gives you a chance to sort of learn about this process, and I think it makes it a little bit easier, okay? Attendance, you can read the attendance policy here. It's actually a requirement for online courses that you check in and log in regularly and you spend time in the course. And I actually am able to track that. So that's really important that you are constantly going into Canvas and you're spending time in the course. If you're not, you have the potential for being dropped from the class because you're not completing the work or because you're not spending enough time in the class. It's a requirement that you are doing that and that we monitor that. And I explained the time commitment a little bit here in office hours as well. And at the close, there's sort of an outline of everything we're doing, all of the different modules. So that kind of gives you a kind of a good sense of all of the things that are happening in this class. And really your job is to explore, to complete these assignments and to work both collectively in the discussion board segments and on your own to learn this material in consultation with me. And that's why I'm here. Each week, I'm going to give you a short introduction and explanation of some of the topics you're going to be learning about, giving you some pointers, showing you a few images perhaps, and getting you off to a good start. If you ever have questions, don't hesitate to drop me a message. I'm really excited to be working with you in this course. It's a really great class. We get to really cover an incredible amount of ground and look at some really interesting stuff, and I'm hoping you'll enjoy the course. So, more to come soon, but let's get started.